Tempus here! Hello and welcome to Feng The Accursed, the second boss in the Mogu-shan Vaults raid. This is a 3-phase fight. The first phase starts 5 seconds after you aggro the boss. When the fight starts, the tanks will be able to pick up one ability each, which they will be able to use throughout the fight. In order to get the ability, the tanks must click one of the 2 floating crystals on either side of the room, which will spawn when you engage the boss. Clicking a crystal consumes it and grants you an ability depending on the crystal you took. One crystal grants the Nullification Barrier, which creates a protective bubble around the tank who uses it. Note that it is channeled, so moving will break this effect. The bubble protects anyone inside from magic damage and debuffs. It has a 1-minute cooldown. The bubble also affects the boss, preventing him from gaining some of his own buffs. The other crystals grant Shrouded Reversal, which can be cast on a raid member, making it so that if the boss hits that person with an ability, the tank will gain that ability and be able to use it against the boss. This has a 30-second cooldown. The tanks should decide who takes which ability ahead of time. For the entire fight, Feng will use Spirit Bolt, dealing shadow damage to random raid members. The boss will also place a stacking debuff on the tank. In Phase 1, it is Lightning Lash, which deals nature damage. In Phase 2, he will use Flaming Spear, which deals fire damage. In Phase 3, he uses Arcane Shock, which deals arcane damage. All these debuffs deal damage every 2 seconds and last for 20 seconds. All these abilities can also be mimicked with Shrouded Reversal and placed on the boss. It is recommended that the off tank should taunt when the main tank has 2 stacks of the debuff. In Phase 1, the boss has 2 other abilities, Epicenter and Lightning Fists. Epicenter is a channeled earthquake which deals massive damage every second. The damage is lower the further you are away from the boss. While he does this, he also reduces all players' hit chance by 75%. Lightning Fists is a shockwave which he casts in front of him, causing it to move slowly across the room in a line. This deals a large amount of nature damage and stuns anyone hit by it. This can be mimicked with Shrouded Reversal. In order to do so, Shrouded Reversal should be cast on a player, preferably the other tank, and then that player should purposefully get hit by the Lightning Fists. In order to deal with Lightning Fists, simply have the tank stand at a 90-degree angle to each other with the rest of the group behind the boss. That way, only one tank will get hit by the ability, and when a tank switch is required, the rest of the group will be either behind the boss or to the side, so they will still be safe. Dealing with Epicenter is a bit more difficult. If the tank managed to get Lightning Fists earlier, then when the boss starts channeling, it can be used to stun him and interrupt Epicenter. If the tank does not have Lightning Fists, then they need to call it out ahead of time, so that the melee can group up with the ranged, who will all be piled in the middle of the room and spam AoE heals. If Nullification Barrier is off cooldown, then the tank can use that to completely negate all damage. When the boss finishes, the melee can return to their original positions. However, ranged need to be careful to avoid Lightning Fists, as the boss will be most likely facing the tanks who are still in the ranged group. Don't worry about interrupting Epicenter with Lightning Fists every time, as this is rather difficult to do. As long as the tank announces whether he can stun or not ahead of time, it can be dealt with and out-healed rather easily. If you are unable to stun or use the barrier, then be sure to use raid cooldowns and personal survival cooldowns for Epicenter, as it hits extremely hard. When you get the boss to 66% health, Phase 2 begins, in which he loses Epicenter and Lightning Fists, replacing the nature damage dot with a fire one, as mentioned earlier. He now gains 2 new abilities, Wildfire Spark and Draw Flame. Wildfire Spark is a debuff that is placed on a random player. After a few seconds, it sheds the debuff and plops a fire puddle underneath the player. The fire patch will slowly grow over time and will deal massive damage to anyone standing in it. Standing in it will also cause it to grow. To deal with this, have all players who get Wildfire Spark run to an allocated area of the room to plop the fire down, and then they should run back. Everyone should avoid standing in the fire as much as possible. The boss's next ability is Draw Flame. When Feng uses this, he will absorb all the wildfire in the room, stacking a buff on himself. The more fire there is, the more stacks of the buff he gets. The buff causes the boss's melee swings to deal damage to the entire raid. Each swing removes the stack of the buff. He uses this every 30 seconds, and pushing him to phase 3 does not remove the buff if he has it on him. When he uses this ability, he really sucks in the flames, causing them to move quickly along the floor, meaning that nobody should be standing between the fire puddles and the boss in case of getting one shot. It is important to note, using Nullification Barrier when the boss is about to finish casting Draw Flame will stop the boss from being able to get the buff, basically cancelling it out. Due to the cooldown on the barrier, this can only be done every second Draw Flame. You especially want to use this when the boss is near 33% health, as if you handle the sparks really well, the boss will generate more stacks than he can actually use, so the stacks keep climbing, so it is ideal to use the barrier on his last Draw Flame to help reduce the damage going into phase 3. All range should be stacked together for AoE healing, however this means that they must also be quick to get out of the way of the fire patches and to move out of the group when they have Wildfire Spark on them. At 33% health, phase 3 begins. He loses his Draw Flame and Wildfire Spark abilities and gains Arcane Velocity and Arcane Resonance. The stacking debuff he puts on the tanks is now changed from Fire to Arcane. Arcane Velocity deals heavy raid damage to everyone, with the damage being higher the further you are away from the boss. To deal with this, everyone should run into the boss and stand on top of him when he uses this to take as little damage as possible. Anyone who has Arcane Resonance, however, must not stack up. Just before Arcane Velocity finishes casting, everyone should spread out again to avoid getting hit by Arcane Resonance. Arcane Resonance will be placed on random players, usually healers or ranged DPS. Arcane Resonance causes players to pulsate arcane energy, hurting themselves and anyone within 6 yards of them. It is extremely important that these affected players avoid hitting other players, as they can easily one-shot a player or cause a complete wipe if they stack up. So, to deal with this, players should spread out, and if they gain Arcane Resonance, they should make sure to be out of everyone's way until it fades. As for Bloodlust and Time Warp, your group should use this in whichever phase you have the most trouble with. Many groups like to use it in phase 2 to push the boss into the next phase, whereas we found it best to use in phase 3, as there is an extreme amount of damage happening in that phase. And that's it for taking out Feng The Accursed in 10-man normal. I hope you enjoyed this guide and found it helpful, and if you did, then be sure to comment, rate, and subscribe for more. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/DGTempusFugit. There is a link in the description to make that really easy for you. Good luck and have fun. Now go kill some accursed Fengs.